Thank you, Member. Oak Bay, Gordon Head.
Thank you. Honourable Speaker, I rise to take my place in the debate on Bill 41, the Advanced Education Statute Repeal Act. As the Minister mentioned, this Act repeals the Public Flexibility and Choice Act that was brought in under the previous government in 2002. Honourable Speaker, within the language of that bill brought in 2002, restrictions were removed, and in particular, the clause, despite any other act or collective agreement, an institution has the right to A, establish the size of its classes, the number of students who may be enrolled in or assigned to a class, and the total number of students who may be assigned to a faculty member in a semester, a term, or an academic year. B, assign faculty members to instruct courses using distributed learning. C, determine its hours of operation and the number and duration of terms or semesters during which instruction is offered to students. D, allocate professional development time and vacation time to facilitate its organization of instruction. And E, provide support for faculty members, including but not limited to teaching assistants, senior students, contractors, and support staff managers. This legislation brought to 2002 was, fortunately, Honourable Speaker, never actually challenged and never actually used, because universities and colleges recognized that the governance style within these academic post-secondary institutions is one of more of a collegial form of governance, one in which an academic environment is governed by the Senate, where there is input from faculty and staff and students in terms of the academic direction of an institution. What was very troubling, of course, is when this act was introduced, it also amended sections to the School Act, which stripped a teacher's bargaining rights related to, or when the prior act was a similar thing, stripped teachers' bargaining rights related to the class size and composition. And remember the infamous Health and Social Services Delivery Improvement Act, which started major labour disputes in our province with healthcare workers. Again, that was also implemented at the same time. It was rather a classic example, Honourable Speaker, of a pendulum that swings when we have governments shift from one to the other side of the political spectrum. If ever there was a compelling testimony as to why proportional representation is important, is it limits these kind of pendulum swings because of the fact that we typically don't go from one extreme to the other. In this example, we're going back to legislations coming in, being repealed. Of course, this should never have been brought in the first place. With the BC Teachers Federation, of the examples I just raised, that dispute lasted for a decade and a half. A decade and a half. How much money, how many hours of lost, how much stress was put on teachers, how much education was not delivered because of time being put to this, because of, frankly, punitive measures that were brought forward by the previous government to the employees within the education sector, whether it be K-12 or both post-secondary institutions. The amendments to the School Act that were brought in with the Public Flexibility and Choice Act were poorly thought out, and it was legislation that caused, as I mentioned, a decade of turmoil, including the longest strike in BCTF's history in 2014, when I was sitting on the other side there. It was based, frankly, Honourable Speaker, on ideology that the government of the day doubled down on as it lost decision after decision until it went to the Supreme Court, which only for a few minutes deliberated before they ruled unanimously on the direction that this should take. I remember, frankly, Honourable Speaker, 3 years ago standing in this House and speaking about the approach of the previous government towards education. At that time, I said that moving the relationship forward between the BCTF and the government would require trust. Mutual trust. It was easy, of course, for me to see why the BCTF and other stakeholders in public education were leery to trust the direction of the previous government. At the time, I was arguing that the Education Statutes Amendment Act 2015 was a classic example of putting the cart before the horse. Rather than engaging education stakeholders in meaningful dialogue, the government was providing itself with rather sweeping powers to appoint special advisors and issue administrative directives. Needless to say, that was not building trust. It was a classic example of the previous government's approach. Instead of working to build trust, the previous administration spent years fighting the BCTF, years and countless dollars in doing so, creating labor disputes, court battles, and strikes until finally the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in favour of the BCTF. They won their challenge because the legislative change is infringed on the BC teachers' freedom of association guaranteed under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. Madam Speaker, I use this example because the Public Flexibility and Choice Act that this bill is repealing here today, that is Bill 41, Advanced Education Statute Repeal Act, has very similar language that I read out earlier, very similar language in it, which in theory could render key sections in collective agreements with post-secondary educators void. You know, coming to a specific example in the previous bill, the Public Education Flexibility and Choice Act that is being repealed, it states here as well, despite any other act or collective agreement, an institution has the right to assign faculty members to instruct courses using distributed learning, to assign to a faculty, establish class sizes, the number of students who may be enrolled in or assigned to a class, and the total number of students who may be assigned to a faculty member. The total number of students who may be assigned to a faculty member. So shows such a fundamental misunderstanding of how universities operate. I taught at a university for 25 years before coming here. Now I had PhD students and master's students. To think here that somehow government was enabling that my institution could tell me how many PhD students I could supervise. Who's going to pay them? We have departmental policy that requires us to find money to pay our students. Who's going to, what about if I wasn't no longer active in research? And on and on and on. It just showed such a fundamental misunderstanding. But in fact, in 2007, the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators noted this. And they stated that this act overruled provisions of their collective agreements that dealt with class size. At the same time, their statement read as follows. This is the statement that they read. Although we have succeeded in preventing post-secondary employers from using the legislation, today's decision adds to our case that the legislation should be scrapped altogether. And that was with respect to a ruling, one of the many rulings that came in the BCTF favor. You know, the Public Flexibility and Choice Act has still not been used to this day, thank goodness. But if it were to be used, I cringe to think of the disputes it would cause and the subsequent legal challenges that could arise. Now, I recognize that this legislation that's still on the books is a blight on the previous government, is a blight on the official opposition, which is why it seems that there are no speakers to this at second reading, and that they'll accept it, and quickly, apart from one just saying in a matter of moments that they'll accept it. We're not getting a detailed discussion and rationale why this was brought in the first place, Honourable Speaker. Why was this brought in the first place? We have members sitting opposite who've been in the BC legislature since 2002, when in fact this legislation was brought. Rather than simply giving us a history, rather than telling us why it was brought in and why they're now supporting it, all they say is we support repealing, in essence. I recognize this as a blight. It's a shameful, painful blight, Honourable Speaker, on 16 years of actually not putting education as a priority in this province. This bill before us today is seeking to remove the controversial piece of legislation that fortunately has never been used before, and frankly, if it were, would likely have triggered, and almost certainly have triggered, legal challenges to the Supreme Court of Canada, where once again it would have been deemed unconstitutional and a violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. This is the legacy that the new government has to deal with, is repealing legislation that yet again would almost certainly have been unconstitutional. And my caucus and I are 100% behind this bill, and with that I thank you for your attention, Honourable Speaker.